So yes, as Ruth has said, I'm talking about a project that I'm doing at the moment called Social Work in the Carceral State, and it is the culmination of research across many projects for more than 10 years. So my presentation today is really just sort of going to tell you a bit of that story, really, and share some recent sort of findings that have come out of work done this year. Thank you, Ruth, for doing the acknowledgement of country. I just also would like to acknowledge First Nations elders who have mentored me throughout this particular research. So Professor Juanita Sherwood, and I'm also grateful to Dr. Maurice Terrer, who is a First Nations scholar who works here, who I think probably everyone here would know, but I'm indebted to them for the wisdom they have shared with me and support and guidance through these years where I've been trying to figure out what I can do that would be useful in this space. So as I said, this is a new project, but it has old roots. And in particular, and this is a project that probably most people in this room would have heard me talk about at least once before. The very first academic job that I had, which began in 2012, was working full-time on a project called the Social and Cultural Resilience and Emotional Wellbeing of Aboriginal Mothers in Prison. Everybody knew it by its acronym, which was SCREAM, and that was a project led by Juanita Sherwood, who I mentioned before, and that was done in partnership with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations around New South Wales. And as part of that project, my job on that project, I went with Juanita to 6 prisons around New South Wales, and we went multiple times to each one to talk to Aboriginal mothers who were incarcerated about their health and their social and emotional wellbeing, which is a First Nations construct for mental health, but that encompasses so much more than what we would understand as mental health through Western knowledge systems. And that work was done on an interdisciplinary team, and then subsequent projects that grew out of that were also interdisciplinary. And one of the things that was interesting about that for me as a social worker was that for myself, my social work identity was very present. I was constantly aware that I was the only social worker on this team, but that was also completely concealed. So it wasn't in my title. When I went into prisons to talk to women, I was there as a researcher, and that social work identity didn't have to be part of the story. And that actually was important. It made a difference to what actually went on in that space, and has caused me to think a lot more over the years about social work identity and our complicity in the carceral state, which is what the current project is now about. So that project was an enormous learning curve for me and has shaped everything that I've done since then. And what has sort of happened as a result of that project is that my research has tended to be all about both the dominant narrative and the contested narrative in the same space. So with the SCREAM project, I went into it as a fairly new social worker, as a new academic, with the commonly held presupposition that services and professionals are good. And what I learned from women's stories was that they had had experiences of punishment, not just in prison, but both before and after. And that those experiences before and after in the service system where social workers are located were at the forefront of women's stories in terms of how they were criminalised and why they were there. Some examples of that from the SCREAM project were very much grounded in racism. So stories about being stereotyped by professionals, being dismissed by professionals, and what happens then is a sort of withholding of services and support. And what we heard was the devastating impacts of that, which I have talked about in lectures and so on before. So I'm not going to go into that today with this short amount of time. What also was apparent in women's stories was institutionalized racism, and particularly in the police, health, and child protection systems. Again, not naming social workers, but as a social worker, as I said, sort of acutely aware of my social work identity, that is what I was hearing, that social workers would have been involved, that's the story of a multidisciplinary team where there would have been a social worker, that's a story of docs getting involved, which it was back then, still docs, I think, maybe facts, where there would have been a social worker around. And women also shared their stories of resistance, of supporting each other, of talking back, of coming up with alternatives when services were withheld, and then stories of how that also was punished. So what came about from that project for me, and through guidance from people I was working with, was this sort of reframing away from this idea that services and professionals are definitely good, and away also from what was a dominant narrative at the time of sort of system failure, to this idea that actually, no, this is systems working precisely the way they are intended to work. And the problem is those systems are cruel. And as I've said, lots of thinking about the role of social work there. In preparation for today, we use this sort of prompt of how do you hope to make a difference with your research as a social worker? And for me, that sort of prompted this sort of question that I often use in my research and teaching which is what knowledge counts or what evidence counts. And, over the years sort of working on this topic of the incarceration and reincarceration of women, because most women in prison have been in prison before, what my experience has been is that there's been projects where the theoretical and methodological frameworks were there to enable doing the kind of work that I would like to do or hope to do as a social worker, doing justice to women's stories. And there were also projects where that didn't work so well, and I wasn't in a leadership position in those projects, but I was part of them. And so, what's the role of social work there in terms of pushing back and so on? So, I have been involved in projects where the discourse of ethical research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which, there's many documents around that. Funding is supposed to be based on that. If you're doing any research where there is, an overrepresentation of First Nations people affected by the research that you're doing, where that discourse has been co-opted. And, there are very different outcomes when that occurs, obviously. So, and in this space around sort of carcerality, the prime way in which I've seen that difference in outcomes appear is in either decisions that we should be focusing on service improvement versus decisions that we should be focusing on problematizing the system itself, that there's no point sort of trying to reform a system that's intrinsically problematic. What we need to do is create a new system altogether. And I, am drawn to the sort of formative paper by Maggie Walter and her colleagues when I think about this. If you don't know this paper, it's one of my favourite social work papers. It's called How White is Social Work in Australia. And, this paper was published at the time that I was doing the SCREAM research. And in fact, Maggie Walter came and did a workshop for us as well. And one of the things that they talk about in that paper is about this sort of paradox in social work in terms of our sort of goals to be anti-oppressive. If we don't at the same time acknowledge that we are picking and choosing, what to what counts as oppression. You know, we're still holding this position of authority. And, you know, research has shown over and over again that people's stories get appropriated to suit professional and academic agendas. So I have seen this happen in projects that I've been involved in. And, you know, and I also have had to learn that curve as well, and still am. I've also seen this extended into projects beyond just Aboriginal women in prison, but to all women in prison, where there are sort of, where people take this position of authority around constructing what women need, both in prison and post-release, sometimes without ever having spoken to a woman in prison about that. So again, sort of inspired by Maggie Walter and her colleagues, my current project is about turning the lens, really, and social work accountability. Fundamentally, it's probably about me grappling with my own complicity in all of this. But, you know, they have this beautiful quote, which I come back to over and over again, which is, you know, which it speaks to this point about turning the lens, which is that, you know, we need to be thinking about what we are doing, how we are doing it, and why. What are the assumptions, and how are they informed by race and white privilege? So my current project is investigating the carceral expansion into human services and the role of social work. At the moment, it's in stage 1, which is taking a making the familiar strange approach, which unfortunately is a Foucauldian approach, you know, a white guy, but anyway. Critical analysis of discourses shaping practice, and in particular, looking at the discourse of gender responsive service provision, which has become ubiquitous in the post-release space, that is seen as sort of the solution to addressing the needs of women in prison. And the problem is very much constructed as, you know, women keep going back to prison because service provision isn't good enough, because services were designed for men. And so we need to make these more woman-centered. So the critical analysis of that is that, you know, we're talking about making more gender responsive cages. And so I would align myself with that point of view, and I'm looking at what is actually sort of underpinning this idea that this is a good approach. And, you know, because my own background's in health and the projects that I have worked on previously were largely located in public health, actually, I'm also sort of looking at this health and social disadvantage discourse. If you look at the literature on the incarceration of women, it's almost formulaic in terms of stating the number of women in prison, the overrepresentation of First Nations women, and then all of the health and social characteristics of women in prison. And so I'm interested in looking at what that actually sort of conceals. And so the findings so far are that there is this sort of obfuscation and deflection around the criminalisation and surveillance and control of women under through the discourse of this is a population who have health and social disadvantages. And, you know, what happens with that construction is a justification that prison is an opportunity to actually do good and to give women services. So, and then the other dominant sort of discourse that's coming out of this work at the moment is one that supports a carceral feminist approach. So this idea that prisons actually are useful in terms of promoting women's safety, and they are based on constructions of vulnerability and victimization that weaponize trauma discourse. So basically, biomedical discourse to pathologize women, and again, justify further professional attention, and the idea that blocking is actually sort of something that minimizes risk for them. Next up in this project, I'm hoping to look at human service experiences of women who have been incarcerated, and also what transition support workers have to say about their interactions with services as well. So thank you.
Yeah. So we have 5 minutes for questions. I don't know, Joel, if there are any questions from the... I forgot to welcome the 9 people, I think, who are with us now. Previously, there were only 7, but there are 9. So welcome, people. I wish we could see you. Can you change the... Okay. Where's the mouse?
Is it touch screen?
Oh, it's touchscreen. Sorry. Okay. Stop share. Right. No, it's not stop. Oh. New technology.
That's very difficult.
Hello, everybody. Can we have sound? Yeah, they turn the things on.
Hi.
Okay. So, okay. So are there any questions from the room to start with? Oh. Sorry, just a sec. When, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. For the people online.
Okay. Yeah.
Will you be exploring the women's experiences of human services prior to entering prison and after, some sort of comparison, or?
I probably won't try and do a comparative analysis. It'll probably just be more women's stories over time. Yeah. Because, yes, also sort of factoring in that corrective services postures themselves as a service. And so I was thinking that what I would do is talk to women who have been fairly recently incarcerated. Also because of recruitment, that sort of simplifies things a little bit, because there's organisations who do that kind of support work who could potentially assist. But then I wouldn't put limitations around what experiences could be shared. Yeah. Thanks, Libby. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm wondering about international comparisons. If that is something that you're starting to look at, is there comparative work happening around the world in this space? Where does Australia compare?
Yeah. Thanks, Joel. It's interestingly, Australian social work is pretty quiet on this. So there are groups of people within social work in the US who have developed a sort of framework called anti-carceral feminist social work, and have published some stuff on that. Some of that's work that brings people from around the world, including some people from Australia who are abolitionists and also social workers, and who are contributing to that scholarship. At the moment, that is at a theoretical level rather than built on empirical research. So that is how I'm hoping to do things a little differently with this research. But then I should also acknowledge that activists, including, women who have been incarcerated themselves, such as, like organisations like Sisters Inside and so on, also publish on these topics and, have that first-hand knowledge to draw on. So it's not just an academic exercise. And people, increasingly are identifying with this framing of anti-carceral feminist social work. In the UK, it's more the reform agenda, which is sort of typical of Australia as well. And, the reform agenda is going reasonably well. So, it's... that's kind of where it's at. So I've not done a research comparison internationally, but that's what I know of the existing research and advocacy and policy work that's happening around the world. Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering if your research touched on incarcerated women as mothers and the additional issues for mothering while in prison, and how
Yeah.
access to their children can be also used as a form of punishment and control.
Yeah, absolutely. So especially with the Scream project, because they were all First Nations mothers who were interviewed, that was at the front of their stories, about, how removal of their children, either before incarceration or because of incarceration, was impacting on their health and well-being. And, part of that was stories around, the distress of trying to have contact, which often was court ordered but wasn't happening, from prison, and maintaining some sort of, I don't think it wasn't constructed by everyone in terms of maintaining a relationship, but it was about wanting to know where they were, talking to them, having some reassurance that they were safe, like at the most basic level. Even that, even those basic things were withheld, is what came through those stories. Yeah. Thanks, Susan.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sacha. That was really great.
Thank you.
Mhm.